firm believer that to know where you are, it's important to know where you came from. That's not a fancy pants way of suggesting that you know your history. That's something that should come naturally, on your terms, should you be interested. Once I got involved in the subculture, much of the knowledge that I picked up about pretty much anything related, music, publications, bands, people, its very inception, were just bits and pieces that I picked up here and there. Late nights, the diner with 3 tables pushed together, drinking coffee with way too much sugar in it, people are chain smoking, through just living the lifestyle, going out and being involved, osmosis, asking questions, conversations, and eventually I was answering questions myself. Back in the 90s, intelligence was an admirable quality. Having knowledge was not a pretentious thing, and offering it up was certainly not an elitist act. There was so much more to it. We loved to impart wisdom because it felt good, and it was also important. It was something that was never forced upon anyone, but it was something that was always taken in with enthusiasm. As a young goth, when a seasoned veteran of the scene spoke, you listened. Not because of hierarchy, not out of respect, because you were genuinely interested in what it was that they had to say. When I do tutorials for things on my channel and I get positive feedback, even better when I see people posting actual things that they've made based upon watching my tutorials and tagging me in it, I'm like a proud mom. I'm really hoping to revive that enthusiasm to know things, because back then knowledge, it was empowering, it was interesting. It was something that you took pleasure in because it involved a subculture that was such an intrinsic part of you, and you to it. As you grow from a baby bat and onward, through you, the subculture lives on because eventually you're going to impart the same wisdom. You're keeping that tradition going, and you're becoming part of that history. There is nothing elitist about that, and having it referred to as such is insulting, and it comes from the minds of the insecure, the sanctimonious, and the uninformed. Coming to you from the very same people that have no valid argument to back any of their ridiculous claims other than, well, just because it is. Well, now that you put it that way, my mind has changed. Many of us who've been involved in the scene for so long have a very deep and meaningful connection to it. It's something that we're quite passionate about. Now, that's not to say that there's not assholes out there, but it's probably best that you learn the difference between an elitist and a jerk who also happens to be a goth. Nowadays, if it identifies as goth and has a bad attitude, it's automatically an elitist. If they're wearing any color other than black, they'd just be a dick. Oh, I've had my encounters with elitists, true elitists back in my early days, and to some of the trigger-happy butthurts out there who are so quick to hurl around the word elitist at anybody who invokes even the slightest insecurity in them, understand this. If the mere mention of music inspires you to shout elitist, holy shit, you would cry and piss yourself simultaneously and hide in the world of K-pop until the end of time, should you have encountered the real thing. I have seen someone turn raver and not return to the clubs for a full year after just one encounter with one of these people. Actually, I think it was more than one, but raver. The thing is, the good always outnumber the bad. There were no rules, no leaders. There was just an unspoken understanding of general etiquette. Back then, no one ever uttered the term elitist. I never even heard it uttered because it wasn't part of our vernacular. It's dramatic, it's overkill, and I guess in some cases where I've seen it today, it's a little bit crybaby. I'm sorry. Now, a term we did use was pretentious, and oftentimes if you were set upon by one of these pretentious goths, it is because you had broken one of these unspoken rules. For example, an obnoxious new guy who's acting like he's king shit and just needs to be taken down a peg. Not always, though, because that's not to say that there weren't some genuinely nice people who got shit and didn't deserve it. There were always a few bad apples, but there were nowhere near enough to spoil the bunch because the New York scene was just way too big for that to happen. Things are very different now, and as a result, I'm at many places online really trying to get a good idea of this new mentality and social structure as it exists today, so I can get a better handle on how to help pull it offline, just a little bit. So some of what I've encountered in social media is a little bit frustrating. So be it on Facebook or message boards or wherever, I've seen people who weren't there in the 80s, weren't there in the 90s, some of which weren't even there in the early to mid 2000s, making statements on the social structure and the dynamics of the subculture back prior to their existence as if it's fact. And they're wrong. Now, should somebody who was actually there try to correct them, it doesn't matter how you approach a situation, because there really is no right way to approach the situation, because 9 times out of 10, you're going to be called an elitist. As for the other things that I've encountered, this was a statement made by somebody trying to further a point that all Goths are elitists. Now, this isn't word for word, but it was something along the lines of, nobody listens to new music or talks about new music because if it isn't Joy Division or it isn't Bauhaus and it didn't come from the 80s, well, then they consider it bullshit. You know, other than Drab Majesty, Lebanon Hanover, in letter form, she passed away. Don't even get me fucking started on the 90s or moving up into the 2000s, but, you know, nothing new. Real Goth died in the 80s because the 90s were a complete departure from true Goth. Firstly, Goth wasn't even Goth in the 80s. It was dark, it was macabre, it had its own aesthetic, and it certainly had its own distinctive soundtrack. It was certainly an entity unto itself, but it didn't have a name for a good while, and once it did, many of the Goths of the 80s, they shunned that label because, at its core, emerging from the punk scene, labels over t-shirts. As we got into the 90s, it became more of an accepted and even embraced term, and the 90s were a great example of the way that evolution was supposed to occur. There was no disconnect from the roots, and it was just a very clean and natural progression. What a lot of people who didn't experience the 90s didn't really understand is that we paid homage to our 80s predecessors in film, in music, in fashion, and we had nights where we would go either classic goth or punky goth, which were terms to define an 80s style of dress. This was completely normal because we all owned the clothing, and again, no subgenres, so we just wore whatever we were feeling. It was just as simple as pulling things out of our closet because it wasn't like putting together a costume, these were our clothes. We loved our 90s music, London After Midnight, Faith in the Muse, Corpus Delicti, Rosetta Stone, Switchblade Symphony, but we had a healthy respect and a very even flow of 80s music as well. Not because we had to, because we loved it and it was something that we held on to, or it held on to us. It was also a very naturally occurring feature, but we also embraced anything new that came along. If the very idea that someone might know something more than someone else triggers them to go on the defensive and resort to name-calling and branding them such a dramatic and insulting label as an elitist, perhaps they should worry a little bit less about being goth and focus a bit more on their ability to interact with people effectively. We are a community after all. To quote Nancy Kilpatrick, anyone born into a competitive society is bound to be competitive. Some more, some less. There are Goths, not all of whom are faux Goth, who have a large stake in being as Goth as they can be. To these Uber Goths, the way that others perceive them matters greatly. So their self-opinion is quite delicately balanced, and to know more than these people, to offer advice, opinions, or even dare correct them, in their minds, this is a direct challenge to their place in the subculture, and it's perceived as, you are not a real Goth. Hence their swiftness to jump on the defensive and shout elitist. Now again, there are actual elitists out there, however, this is a word that's used oftentimes so out of context. And this is why you should consider looking into a bit of the history. If you did, you'd get a whole new perspective on how the subculture functions and you'd realize that you're not under attack. You're part of a community, and knowledge is to guide, not to insult.